Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ange Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going over my wide receiver rankings for the 2019 fantasy football season. Yes, it may be early, but it's never too early to talk fantasy football, and that's exactly what we're going to do. As per usual, we're going over a wide receiver rankings top 12 at the half-point PPR scoring format. But before we get into that, I want to go ahead and thank all of you who have continued to support the channel. Leave likes on the videos, comments down below, and most importantly, subscribing to the channel. This week, instead of having David Bakhtiari as your challenge, I thought, maybe there's too many Packers coming up on the screen. So we'll throw the opposite of a Packer within the division, a division rival, Xavier Rhodes, cornerback of the Minnesota Vikings. I challenge you this week. Maybe hit a slant, a 9 route, a post corner, a zig. Get that cursor past Xavier Rhodes and to the subscribe button for more content coming your way for the 2019 fantasy football season. Again, thank you all of you who have continued to support. Hey everybody, how's it going? All right, so we're talking the wide receiver position today, and most importantly, my top 12 rankings. Now, as you all know, rankings are always subject to change. Again, it's only May 25th today. And I'm sure these rankings are going to change by the time season starts. So no big deal. Either way, let's talk about my number one wide receiver as of right now for the 2019 season is Davante Adams. You saw him in the thumbnail. All right, so why do I have so much confidence in Davante Adams? Because already I know I've struck a nerve with some of you. A lot of you do believe that DeAndre Hopkins is the number one wide receiver. Now, I'm going to try to give you my argument for why I think Davante Adams is going to take that next step forward this season. And then after, we'll talk about DeAndre Hopkins and where I see him at. But either way, Davante Adams, last season, what was he able to produce? He had 169 targets, 111 receptions, 1,386 receiving yards for 13 receiving touchdowns. All that accumulated in half-point PPR scoring formats for 274.1 fantasy points. Now, last season, he only played 15 games because in Week 17 against the Lions, they really felt there was no purpose to play Davante Adams. They weren't going to make the playoffs, and there's no point in, straining a player that, doesn't really have to be. So last year, in 15 games, he averaged 18.27 fantasy points per game. I mean, pretty ridiculous to say the least. Now, the improvement that Davante Adams saw from 2017 to 2018 by season's end was pretty ridiculous. He saw an uptick of 44% more targets, 50% more receptions, and 56% more receiving yards from 2017 to 2018. So pretty big difference. Now, a lot of that had to do with the fact that Davante Adams truly was the number one wide receiver in this offense. In seasons past, we've seen him, with the likes of Jordy Nelson, with Randall Cobb, who, have been favorites of Aaron Rodgers throughout his entire career. So the fact that those two guys, Jordy Nelson, through free agency was let go, went to the Oakland Raiders, and Randall Cobb last season dealt with a plethora of injuries, Davante Adams just purely had to step up in order to help his team win on a weekly basis, and that's what he did. Yes, it didn't lead to many victories for the Green Bay Packers last season, but it did help Davante Adams' fantasy value, which, goodness gracious, was fantastic. Last season in 2018, Davante Adams ended as the number 3 ranked wide receiver in total points scored, which is pretty good considering the year prior he ended as the number 14. So he made a pretty big jump in 2018. Now, a lot of that had to do with target share, and we're going to go over this with the rest of the receivers and how target share and red zone target share makes a huge difference for the wide receivers in fantasy. So last season, Davante Adams saw 28.17% of the Green Bay Packers offensive targets. So 28% of the balls that came out of Aaron Rodgers' hands while he was passing the ball went towards Davante Adams. Now, besides the fact that that's pretty good share by itself, we've seen other players, and we'll talk about other players that were higher than him. But either way, nearly 30% of the target share, that's fantastic for fantasy purposes. That's more opportunity for him that are going to lead to more fantasy points. Now, other than that, the red zone target share. This was an extremely important statistic for Davante Adams in 2018 because he led all receivers in red zone target share. Last season, he had the most targets amongst all receivers in the red zone, 31, and he had 41.89% of the Green Bay Packers target share in the red zone. I mean, 41% of the, almost nearly 42% of the passes went Davante Adams' way when they got into the red zone. That's pretty ridiculous. On those 31 targets, he had 16 receptions. Not a great catch rate, 51% catch rate, but he did have 12 touchdowns on those 16 receptions, which brings a lot of Davante Adams' value to fantasy, right? Catching those balls in the red zone that lead to touchdowns, I mean, that's exactly where Davante Adams finds his value. He's one of the only players that has scored 10-plus touchdowns each of the last 3 seasons, 10 plus. Davante Adams is just ridiculously efficient in the red zone, and because he's attached to Aaron Rodgers, it helps that much more. And it's not a surprise. Many of you may be considering, is that a surprise that Davante Adams happened to see so many targets? It's not, because in 2016, Jordy Nelson led the NFL in targets in the red zone. So to read a couple of Jordy Nelson's stats from 2016, Jordy Nelson ended the 2016 season as the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy points scored. Not a surprise. That's because he led all wide receivers in red zone targets, which was 32. So he even had more than Davante Adams this past year in 2016. So that season, he had 32 targets, 21 receptions in the red zone, a little bit better than Davante this past season, and 11 receiving touchdowns. So it's not a surprise that we see Green Bay Packers wide receivers have so much fantasy value, because in the red zone, out of the red zone, they're being targeted by one of the best quarterbacks to play the game. It's Aaron Rodgers. So why do I have Davante Adams as my number 1 wide receiver? Last year, he ended with 8 wide receiver 1 performances, 6 wide receiver 2 performances. And as I'll go through this entire video, wide receivers, I mean, when we look at the top 12 on a weekly basis for 2018, it's a bunch of names. There's wide receivers that come out of nowhere and have wide receiver 1 weeks, and then they just disappear. So the consistency of staying within his 14 games, or within his 15 games played, he was a number 1 or 2 wide receiver in 14 of those 15 games. That's just pure consistency, and that's what led Davante Adams to scoring, 18 plus fantasy points per week on average. So where do I see him next year? With the Green Bay Packers not addressing the wide receiver position, they're not bringing in anybody new. In fact, they've even lost Randall Cobb through free agency. Obviously, he's getting older, but no big deal. I mean, outside of Davante Adams, you have Geronimo Allison, you have Marquez Valdes-Scantling, you have St. Brown. These are not experienced receivers. And the fact of the matter is that Aaron Rodgers is going to have to lean upon Davante Adams once again this season. That's where I expect him to be. I expect him to be leaned upon. I expect him to see an uptick in targets, receptions, and touchdowns this coming season, receiving yards, the whole plethora of stats. And I expect him to be the number 1 wide receiver. He's going to take that extra step forward. And I see Davante Adams being one of the most trusted wide receivers in the NFL, especially one of the best quarterbacks. He's going to be my number 1 wide receiver. Let me know what you guys think. Maybe go down to the comment section. See, what do you guys think should be the number 1 wide receiver? I know many of you may be thinking it's DeAndre Hopkins. Maybe somebody else. Let me know. And while you're down there, click that like button. Okay, anyway. So moving on, let's talk about my number 2 wide receiver, DeAndre Hopkins. Now, again, many people do believe he's the number 1 wide receiver, and you're not wrong to believe that. There's absolutely an argument for Davante Adams and DeAndre Hopkins to be switched on this list. You never know. In time, because rankings are subject to change, it could change. But as of right now, what did DeAndre Hopkins accomplish last season? He had 163 targets for 115 receptions, 1,572 receiving yards, and 11 receiving touchdowns, all accumulating to 276 fantasy points in half-point PPR scoring formats, which landed him as the number 2 ranked wide receiver, only behind Tyreek Hill. With that, he averaged 17.25 fantasy points per game. I mean, goodness, he was just as dependable of a receiver as you could find. And that's exactly what DeAndre Hopkins has been throughout his entire career. I mean, it's needless to say that DeAndre Hopkins he's went through the ringer, okay? In his entire career, he's dealt with 10 different starting quarterbacks, whether it was starting with Matt Schwab, we saw Brian Hoyer, Ryan Fitzpatrick, TJ Yates, Brock Osweiler, Tom Savage. Now we've finally landed, I know I'm missing one, I think Brandon Weeden was there as well. Now we finally landed with the likes of Deshaun Watson. a quarterback that honestly is just going to continue to help DeAndre Hopkins' value and vice versa. They're going to help each other because of how talented they are. So going into this season, what are the arguments to have DeAndre Hopkins this high? Well, the fact of the matter is he's just been so consistent over the last couple of years. Obviously, in that season in which Brock Osweiler was a starting quarterback, he had a little bit of a dip in production, but I mean, when Osweiler's throwing the ball, I don't expect much. But what did DeAndre Hopkins do last season that was extremely important? Last season, his target share within the Houston Texans offense was 32.27% of the passes. So, I mean, he had an even higher target share than Davante Adams last year, if you can imagine that. His red zone target share consisted of 25 targets, which was 31.65% of the targets in the red zone. Pretty good. All leading to 15 receptions for 8 touchdowns. I mean, that's all you ask for. You ask for a high target share in the red zone, which that's exactly what he saw. High target share outside of the red zone, so we can get him set up. And then a high target or reception count leading to touchdowns. And that's exactly what he did. Now, why do I have DeAndre Hopkins a little bit lower than Davante Adams in my eyes? Specifically, last season, one of the most important stats for DeAndre Hopkins was that DeAndre Hopkins played 1,084 of the 1,094 offensive snaps for the Houston Texans, meaning he played 99.08% of offensive snaps last year. He never came off the field offensively. He was on the field every single down and literally only missed 10 downs all of the entirety of the 2018 season, which is incredible. I don't think you'll see another wide receiver ever accomplish this. I don't even know if we'll see DeAndre Hopkins accomplish this in the future. But what does that kind of lead me to the belief? Of the 1,084 offensive snaps, he was only targeted 163 times. That is not enough. If you're going to be on the field so often, you should be seeing 200 targets. But the fact of the matter is this Texans offense is not built that way. I understand that DeAndre Hopkins is getting double covered, but that's not going to change going into the future. In fact, I think it's going to hurt DeAndre Hopkins with the arrival or the comeback of Will Fuller, who dealt with injuries his last couple seasons, Kiki Kuti, who was plagued with injuries as well during the regular season last year. With their returns, there's going to be more options for Deshaun Watson to find in the passing game. Obviously, last season, majority of it was drop back, find Hopkins. Otherwise, I'm scrambling and scoring, right? This coming season, with Will Fuller in this offense, with Kiki Kuti in this offense in the slot, they're going to present more value for Deshaun Watson. And it's, I think, going to overall help the Texans, but it's going to hurt DeAndre Hopkins' value because I don't see him increasing his target count by a tremendous amount. I don't think that, if this offense improves because of the other weapons, I don't think it's going to lead to DeAndre Hopkins, completely losing his mind and having an even better season come 2019. And that's why I'm a little skeptical. That's why I have Davante Adams, as my number one. Anyway, to close, DeAndre Hopkins last season had 7 wide receiver 1 performances and 6 wide receiver 2 performances. Again, consistency. 13 of his 16 games, he was in the top 24 wide receivers, which is exactly what we want. And that's exactly why we have DeAndre Hopkins at number 2. He stays on the field. He's consistent. He has a great volume of targets, and he produces on those targets. The offense is going to improve, and I'm sure, yes, he's going to still be the number 1 there. But he's still an extremely valuable wide receiver, and that's why he's my number 2. All right, let's talk about my number 3 wide receiver. We're talking about Julio Jones of the Atlanta Falcons. Now, Julio Jones is one of the, I wouldn't say undervalued. I just feel like he doesn't get enough respect for what he's capable of doing and what he does for the Atlanta Falcons on a yearly basis. So let's talk about Julio Jones. Last season, he had 170 targets for 113 receptions, 1,677 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns, all accumulating to 269.3 fantasy points, averaging out to 16.83 fantasy points per game in half-point PPR scoring formats. Now, Julio Jones last year ended as the number 5 wide receiver in fantasy. Now, here's the thing. Julio Jones, throughout his entire career, he's been one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. It's no secret, and that's what he is. But why does he sit here at the number 3 spot comparatively, maybe higher or lower? Well, I have a lot of confidence in Julio Jones because comparatively to all wide receivers last year, he had the most wide receiver 1 performances at 10. Imagine that. 10 of his weeks, 10 of his 16 games, he was a wide receiver 1. I mean, that's pretty ridiculous. On top of that, there was 10 different games last season in which he had 100+ receiving yards. He also had 10 games of 17+ fantasy points last season. I mean, goodness gracious. Julio Jones lived up to that wide receiver 1, maybe even first round wide receiver value, without a doubt, last season. I mean, it's been pretty ridiculous. Even with the offensive coordinator, Steve Sarkisian, who has now been replaced by Dirk Cutter, even with him, leading this offense, with the offensive coordinator duties, it really didn't affect Julio Jones too much. Now, I'll tell you where it did affect him and where he's going to improve and where he'll end up this coming season. But overall, Julio Jones still one of the elite. So last season, Julio Jones saw 27.55% target share. And, again, that's a great number. If you have more than 25% of the target share, that's exactly what you want as a wide receiver 1. Now, outside of the 10 games in which he had 100+ receiving yards and the 10 games of 17+ fantasy points, he was also the number 3 ranked wide receiver with catches of 20+ yards. He had 24 of them, only behind Tyreek Hill and Mike Evans. We'll talk about Mike Evans in a little bit. But he had 24 catches for 20+ yards. Again, this is another one of these receivers that's a deep threat, and he's going to continuously make his fantasy points and value with the ability to, in one-on-one coverage, even 2-on-1 coverage, he's going to still beat you deep. He's a bigger target, and in the red zone, he should be better, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. In the last 2 seasons, Julio Jones has only been targeted 36 times in the red zone, which is embarrassing because a little bit prior, I talked about Davante Adams just this past year being targeted 31 times in the red zone. So the fact that Davante Adams just in 1 year almost surpassed the last 2 seasons of Julio Jones red zone targets, that's embarrassing, right? Those 36 targets led to only 15 receptions and 6 receiving touchdowns. And I 100% believe that's to blame with the offensive coordinator setting up plays. I don't think Steve Sarkisian did exactly what he had to. I think, if anything, he hurt this offense by trying to see Julio Jones in the red zone and perhaps force feed him at times, which kind of led them away from him, which led them to finding guys like Calvin Ridley last year who had 10 receiving touchdowns. When you have a guy like Julio, you have to target him, and obviously his value is going to find other places, but I think this coming season, he's going to see more targets in the red zone. I think the offense is going to adapt, and they're going to find Julio in the red zone more often. Again, one of the receivers that had less than 10 touchdowns, yet he was still the number 5 wide receiver. So if we can see an increase in touchdowns, targets in the red zone, and all of that opportunity leading to more receptions, we're going to see Julio Jones take another step forward this season with Matt Ryan and this incredible offense that they're building. And he's going to be my number 3 wide receiver this year. That's Julio Jones. All right, moving on. Number 4, Odell Beckham Jr. finding a new home in Cleveland. Goodness, wow. Okay, so here's the thing about Odell Beckham. We don't know. We have not seen him and Baker Mayfield play together. We haven't, right? So a lot of this is speculation, just like all these rankings. These are all speculation. I'm predicting the future. Now, it could be wrong, could be right, but I have reasons to believe that Odell Beckham is a good enough wide receiver to, no matter what offense he's in, especially in an improved offense like the Cleveland Browns currently have, I think he's going to improve fantasy-wise, and that's why I have him at number 4. Last season, he had 124 targets, 77 receptions, 1,052 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, 2 passing touchdowns, all leading to 195.84 fantasy points, leading to 16.32 fantasy points per game. Now, here's the thing. Odell Beckham last season missed weeks 14, 15, 16, and 17. So he only played 12 games last year. Having only played 12 games, Odell Beckham still ended as the number 15 wide receiver in fantasy football. And on top of that, right, that was with Eli Manning, guys. That was with Eli Manning, and he was still the number 15 ranked wide receiver in fantasy. Last season, he had 5 wide receiver 1 performances. and he was consistently good. Again, 2 passing touchdowns. Obviously, that's not something that we can guarantee, but hey, if he can throw the ball better than Eli, then goodness gracious. But anyway, what have we seen Odell Beckham capable of in the last couple seasons? In his first 3 seasons in the NFL, Odell Beckham averaged 152 targets a season, 107 receptions, 1,374 receiving yards, and 11.7 touchdowns per season within his first 3 years, right? And that's all with Eli Manning. Now, when you put him in an offense like the Cleveland Browns have, with the second-ranked offensive line from 2018, according to Pro Football Focus, with a better quarterback in Baker Mayfield, with better offensive weapons. Now, I understand Saquon Barkley is a hell of a running back and a receiver out of the backfield. We have Evan Ingram over there, Sterling Shepard. Great. That's fine. But you have the likes of Jarvis Landry, who's going to now be allowed to move down into the slot. Last season, Jarvis Landry ended as the number 18th ranked wide receiver in fantasy points, playing on the outside. And that was his worst statistical season of his entire career. Now that you move him into the slot, he's only going to improve. And when he improves, goodness, there's going to be more opportunity for Odell Beckham to statistically improve himself. On top of it, when we look at what Odell Beckham was able to, statistically achieve last year, from weeks 1 through 13, the only games that he was healthy and played, at the end of those 13 weeks, compared to all wide receivers, he was the number 7th ranked wide receiver. And an offense who, yes, they like to throw the ball a lot in New York, but then again, you're catching passes from a guy that's really not great. And when you add him into this offense that has a great offensive line, that has offensive weapons like Jarvis Landry, David Njoku, Nick Chubb, eventually Kareem Hunt, there's going to be a lot to manage for defenses, and they're going to have a hard time. But that 100%, in my opinion, is going to lead to Odell Beckham stepping up and having a great 2019 season as a member of the Cleveland Browns. Again, this is a lot of speculation. We don't know what we're going to see of this Cleveland Browns team. We've seen them make a lot of moves in free agency. We've seen them, address some positions in the draft. The coaching staff's a little bit changed comparatively to last year. But I think with Baker Mayfield going into his second season, having more confidence and having more understanding of the playbook, the offense, defenses, it's only going to lead to Odell Beckham having a better experience and going from the number 15th ranked wide receiver with only 12 games last season to potentially being my number 4, and that's where I'm going to leave him at. All right, let's move on to number 5. Let's talk about Michael Thomas. Now, Michael Thomas, leading wide receiver for the Saints the last couple seasons, last year had 147 receptions for 125 receiving yards, 1,405 receiving. 1,405 receiving yards. I thought I misspoke. 9 receiving touchdowns, all accumulating to 253 fantasy points and 15.81 fantasy points per game. Last season, he ended as the number 6 wide receiver in fantasy with 7 number 1 wide receiver performance. 7 wide receiver 1 performances, not number 1 wide receiver performances. That would be insane, okay? So here's the thing about Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas is hyper efficient, okay? Last season, 147 targets, 125 receptions. That's an 85% catch rate. I mean, nobody else in the NFL is that efficient. Right now, understandably, when you're getting, majority of your passes coming from Drew Brees, one of the most efficient passing quarterbacks, having 74% completion percentage last year, it kind of begins to make sense. But either way, Michael Thomas is an extremely efficient wide receiver, and only seeing 147 targets last season, that's too low. Okay, when you have guys like Julio Jones and Davante Adams breaking the 170 markers and getting into that range of even perhaps getting to 190 targets in a season, it's a little disappointing to only see Michael Thomas with 147 last season. Now, it kind of affected his fantasy value, and I think if the New Orleans Saints can effectively get him the ball more times per game, you have one of the best wide receivers in the game on your hands here, Michael Thomas. So last season, what were they able to? Last season, Michael Thomas saw 28.32% of the target share of the New Orleans Saints offense. Not a big deal because they're throwing the ball less there. We've seen Drew Brees throw the ball 600 times a season, but in the last couple of years, just go watch last week's quarterback video. It's a huge dip from seasons prior. But either way, Michael Thomas is still seeing his targets. On top of that, last season, he had 29.59% of the red zone targets. It's a great amount right there. And that all led, those 29 targets in the red zone, to 24 receptions and 7 touchdowns. Again, hyper efficient. This guy is not going to drop the ball. Had 82.76% catch rate in the red zone. So here's the thing. I'm leading you somewhere, right? This is a narrative that I'm trying to lead you to. Last season, when Michael Thomas was given the ample amount of opportunity, which I saw to be 10 plus targets last season, he was unbelievable. In games, 6 games last season, where he saw 10 plus targets, he averaged 23.93 fantasy points per game in games in which he had 10 plus targets. Now, outside of those 6 games in which he was getting 10 plus targets, where he was an absolute animal carrying your fantasy teams, outside of those 6 games, the rest of the season in those 10 games, he only averaged 10.94 fantasy points per game. Now, 10 points is not a big deal, but when we're talking about your wide receiver 1, it's a little unfortunate that we're seeing Michael Thomas not get the amount of targets he needs to in order to be a higher ranked wide receiver. And that's why I have him at number 5. He's an extremely good wide receiver and is the number 6 wide receiver last season. But until we can see him with 10 plus targets a week, which is possible, he's close. We can get him to 165 targets next year. There's going to be even more opportunity for Michael Thomas to prove a point, maybe even move up in these rankings. But as of right now, Michael Thomas, he has great value. The thing is, the New Orleans Saints, they've brought in talent. They brought in the likes of Jared Cook. I'm sure Ted Ginn coming back from injury. I know he's getting older, but still, he makes a big difference. Traquan Smith's going to have more value. I don't see Michael Thomas being given that opportunity just because of how much they're throwing the ball there. They're continuing to decrease the amount of passing attempts that Drew Brees is going to throw on a regular basis. So in that, with those facts, I'm just kind of moving Michael Thomas a little bit lower than expected. He's my number 5. Moving on to number 6, Juju Smith-Schuster, closing out my top 6 wide receivers. Now, I heard a lot of noise in the comment section. Where's Ben Roethlisberger in the top 12 quarterback? Okay, here's the deal. When you lose the likes of Antonio Brown, it's going to hurt you, and that is a fact. But who's going to benefit from this? Juju Smith-Schuster, without a doubt. Last season, 166 targets, 111 receptions, 1,426 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, all accumulating to 241.4 fantasy points, 15.09 fantasy points per game in half-point PPR scoring format. That's great. Last season, only had 4 wide receiver 1 performances. Not great, but we'll get there, okay? Juju Smith last season ended as the number 9 wide receiver. Imagine quarterback. Number 9 wide receiver. And, here's the thing about Juju Smith-Schuster. When Antonio Brown leaves this offense, there's one of 2 things that is going to happen, okay? Either Antonio Brown's presence improved Juju Smith-Schuster because he pulled away coverage. He was able to, kind of give him the lesser wide receiver guarding him, the lesser cornerback, the number 2 cornerback on teams were having to, guard him. Perhaps it's going to hurt him. Or perhaps the quite opposite is he's going to see more targets, he's going to see more opportunity, and he's going to step up to the occasion. And I think that's what he's going to be able to do. Last season, he saw 24.09% of the offensive targets. Again, as the number 2 wide receiver on an offense, he was seeing 24% of the targets. That's only going to increase. Red zone target share. Imagine this. Juju Smith-Schuster saw a 30.85% red zone target share with 29 targets leading to 16 receptions and 5 touchdowns. Again, that number is going to increase because of the absence of Antonio Brown. They're just going to continue to throw the ball towards Juju Smith-Schuster. Now, whether or not that helps the offense of the Steelers, we're going to have to wait and see. But Juju Smith-Schuster is going to get the opportunity to be the number 1 wide receiver of the Steelers offense. And what we've seen in years past, just the 3 years prior to Juju Smith's arrival in Pittsburgh, Antonio Brown averaged 176 targets per season. So without Antonio Brown, Juju Smith being the number 1, we've seen it in years past. The number 1 wide receiver of the Pittsburgh Steelers is going to see a hell of a lot of targets, and that opportunity is going to lead to success. And that's exactly where I see Juju Smith ending. He's my number 6 wide receiver because of that. And, hopefully this offense ends up picking up a little bit where they left off last season. But, Juju Smith, only time will tell. All right, moving on to my number 7 wide receiver. Let's talk about Mike Evans. Okay, so Mike Evans is a little bit special. I think some of his stats kind of surprised me when I was pulling him up, doing my little evaluation on him. All right, so last season he had 138 targets for 86 receptions. Again, less than 100 receptions. That's the first time we've seen it in this top 12 list so far. So 86 receptions for 1,524 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns, all leading to 247.4 fantasy points. That being 15.46 fantasy points per game. He ended as the number 8 wide receiver in fantasy last year. Now, all of that led to 7 wide receiver 1 performances, which, to be honest, wasn't much of a surprise. Whether it was with Ryan Fitzpatrick last year or Jameis Winston, Mike Evans was extremely good. Mike Evans had one of his best seasons of his entire career, made a pretty big comeback from seasons prior. And to be honest, with the quarterback changing so often, it really didn't matter because Mike Evans is the number 1 wide receiver of this team. He's going to continue to see the targets. But comparatively to other receivers, again, this is a receiver that saw less targets than even Michael Thomas, who I was complaining about just a couple minutes ago, right? But what it was so special about Mike Evans last season was that he saw, let's get to this one first. Mike Evans had the second most receptions of 20-plus receiving yards, only behind Tyreek Hill and in front of Julio Jones, like I mentioned earlier. He had 26 receptions of 20-plus receiving yards, meaning Mike Evans, he is the bigger-bodied receiver. He's the receiver that's going to go downfield. Even though he's not as fast as some of these other deep threats, he's got the size and he's got the prowess to be able to outstrength and go up and make plays on the ball. And that's exactly where he's used in this offense. Last season, he had 7 performances of 100-plus receiving yards. And that 100% has to do with those 7 wide receiver 1 performances. Last year, he only saw 22.08% of the target share of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense. Now, even though that's the lowest amongst the wide receivers that we've talked about so far, the thing is, the other wide receivers of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they've gone bye-bye. There's no more Deshaun Jackson. There's no more Adam Humphries. You have Mike Evans and you have Chris Godwin. And that's it. Obviously, O.J. Howard's coming back. You still have Cameron Bray. You have some other wide receivers there. But outside of those, there's really not much else. And hopefully what we're going to see is Mike Evans get an absolute increase in targets and receptions and all of that leading to the opportunity to see him be the number 7 wide receiver in 2019. His red zone target share, not great. As a big-bodied receiver like I've talked about, he didn't see much. He only saw 15.91% of the targets, only 14 targets leading to 6 receptions and 4 touchdowns. Now, that scares the shit out of me. That not only scares me with Mike Evans, but a little bit with Julio Jones. Because if you weren't able to get the ball to Mike Evans very often, maybe perhaps Dirk Cutter can't get the ball to Julio Jones, but only time will tell. But either way, I have Mike Evans as my number 7 wide receiver because I think with Bruce Arians coming into this offense, being able to change the entire franchise dynamic and the offense as a whole, because we've seen Bruce Arians come in and have Carson Palmer be a top 12 quarterback and use Larry Fitzgerald to a crazy amount and have him be extremely relevant in fantasy. I expect to see that with Mike Evans this year. I expect him to be the number 1 wide receiver to Jameis Winston and lead this offense in a division which they're going to be able to take advantage of. When you play in the NFC South against the New Orleans Saints, which for much of last season was the worst secondary in the league in terms of fantasy points given up. When you play against the Falcons, when you play against the Panthers, there's a lot of fantasy value to be had, and that's where I see Mike Evans at number 7. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about Antonio Brown. Now, we talked about Juju Smith a little while ago and how Antonio Brown's presence, no longer being there makes a difference. But where does Antonio Brown go? Where does his fantasy value end up next season? Last year, he had 168 targets, 104 receptions for 1,297 receiving yards, and 15 receiving touchdowns. Goodness gracious. Oh, he had 15 receiving touchdowns. Juju's only going to improve. Those are going to go to him eventually, right? All of that led to 271.7 fantasy points and 18.11 fantasy points per game. Last season, Antonio Brown, it's not a surprise. 9 wide receiver 1 performances, the second most amongst wide receivers, only behind Julio. had a 26% target share, 27% target share in the red zone, 24 targets for 11 receptions, 6 touchdowns. Great. All of that is fantastic, and I expect Antonio Brown to be a good receiver. There's a reason why the Raiders went out and got him. It's not because he's out of his prime and they're, no. Antonio Brown is still a top wide receiver. He's still an elite wide receiver in this league, but he is subject to Derek Carr. Now, whether that's, a damnation that's going to completely ruin Antonio Brown's value, I don't know. I don't know whether to believe that Derek Carr can actually figure it out. But if he's able to, great. That's fantastic. We've seen him in seasons prior be able to throw and have, Michael Crabtree and Amari Cooper both in the same season, 100 targets plus, 1,000 receiving yards plus, both of them. So we've seen Derek Carr be relevant in fantasy, and be able to feed wide receivers. Now, the last couple seasons, what have we seen? We've seen the worst Derek Carr in a while. Now, I don't know whether that's going to change. I don't know if the Oakland Raiders are going to be able to turn it around this year, but I still expect Antonio Brown to use his talent and ability to improve the players around them, and that being Derek Carr. I think even though Derek Carr may be a trash can at sometimes, he still has the ability to play quarterback in the NFL. He's one of the 32 starting quarterbacks in this league for a reason. And I think Antonio Brown, yes, statistically is going to have a little bit of a rough time. He's not going to get those 15 receiving touchdowns. He might consistently see the amount of targets and receptions, but I think this coming season, I expect a little bit less because of the offense that he's in comparatively to before. So that's why I have him as my number 8 wide receiver. Goodness, did that again. All right, moving on. Let's talk about my number 9 wide receiver. We have Keenan Allen. Now, when we get to this number 9 spot, it really becomes like a puzzle, right? Because you can interchange pieces, and they're all, it becomes personal opinion rather than just straight facts. But here's the thing. Last season, Keenan Allen had 136 targets, 97 receptions, 1,196 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns for 211.6 fantasy points. All of that leading to 14.1 fantasy points per game in 15 games. There was one game against the Kansas City Chiefs later on in the season, literally on a play that he wasn't even targeted, got a concussion, left. So I'm not going to really count that statistically against him. But again, last season he ended as the number 12 wide receiver in only 15 games. Great. That's fantastic. Imagine Odell Beckham, again, number 15 wide receiver in 12 games. It's going to imagine, okay? So anyway, Keenan Allen. Last season saw 28.69% of the targets of the Los Angeles Chargers. Saw 23.44% of the targets in the red zone. 15 targets leading to 11 receptions for 6 touchdowns. That's fantastic. Now, here's the thing. Keenan Allen last season, when he came into the season, didn't look great. Now, I don't know what we can attribute that to, whether that was the target count, whether it was matchups, or whether it was just happened to be what it was. But when the season got to about the second half of the season, from weeks 9 through 14, we saw a different Keenan Allen. And that Keenan Allen was absolutely ridiculous. In those 6 weeks, weeks 9 through 14, Keenan Allen had 5 wide receiver 1 performances and 1 wide receiver 2 performances, leading to games of 18.2, 14.7, 19.5, 16.7, 29.8, and 16.3 fantasy points in those 6 games. Holy moly. I mean, it almost seemed like a different Keenan Allen, right? This offense was completely in stride, and they were torching defenses, and that was because of the fact that Keenan Allen had finally found himself, being an offensive threat that they were depending on a weekly basis. Keenan Allen kind of turned the leaf. I mean, we know what he's capable of. We've seen him in years prior even have better statistics than he did last year. In 2017, he had more receiving yards, he had more receptions, he had more targets than 2018. And I think a lot of that had to do with the offense kind of leading with the running game a little bit, kind of leading to, when we get down to the red zone, we have to run the ball. We're going to give the ball to Melvin Gordon, have him, take care of it. Now, when 2019 kind of approaches us, Tyrell Williams gone out of the offense. So who do we have? We have Keenan Allen or Mike Williams. Make your choice. Maybe you can throw the ball to Hunter Henry, but Keenan Allen has more opportunity this year when it comes to wide receivers. It's not going to be Tyrell Williams to throw the ball to. I don't think Travis Benjamin's going to make any big difference. I think Keenan Allen in 2019, with what we saw late in last season, that's exactly what the Keenan Allen we want to see in 2019. Now, we're not going to see that on a weekly basis. He's not going to be able to get his targets per game when you play matchups in which Mike Williams is in the red zone catching touchdowns, which he's capable of doing, or we see games where Melvin Gordon and Austin Eckler are taking over. But I think Keenan Allen, with the consistent amount of target share that he's seen, nearly 29% last year, and he's seen higher in seasons prior, I think we're going to get back to feeding Keenan Allen the ball, and I think that's why I have him at number 9. So let's move on to the last 3 guys I want to talk about. Goodness, it's hot in my room. The light that's burning down on me is killing me, guys. All right, here we go. All right, we cracked the knuckles a little bit. All right, number 10, T.Y. Hilton. Now, what did T.Y. Hilton do last year? In only 14 games played, he had 120 targets, 76 receptions for 1,270 yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, 201 fantasy points, all leading to 14.36 fantasy points per game. All right, now here's the thing about T.Y. Hilton. T.Y. Hilton is attached to one of the best quarterbacks in the league. My number 2 quarterback, in fact, in fantasy football when it comes to the rankings. If you haven't seen the video, check it out. All right, now here's the thing. T.Y. Hilton is not like these other wide receivers. He's basically known for being a deep threat. He's a smaller stature wide receiver, great speed, and that's what kind of sets him apart from these other wide receivers that are big-bodied, can go find themselves in the red zone, catching touchdowns left, right, and center. Last season, T.Y. Hilton used his deep threat ability to his advantage, and he continues to do it year in and year out. Last season, he had 22 catches for 20-plus yards. That had him ranked at number 5 in 20-plus yard receptions. He had 6 receptions of 40-plus yards or more, tied him with the number 2 rank. And he had 5 games of which he had 100-plus receiving yards, tied him at number 6 last season. So T.Y. Hilton, he's a deep threat. He is going to make majority of his value in his receiving yards. Again, he had 76 receiving yards for 1,270 receiving. He had 76 receptions for 1,270 receiving yards. I mean, just his yards per catch is ridiculous in itself. So where are we going to see if T.Y. Hilton in 2019? The offense of the Indianapolis Colts, it continues to improve. From what we saw of Eric Ebron with Jack Doyle coming back, Devin Funch is being brought in the offense. Goodness gracious, we have Marlon Mack out of the backfield, Naeem Hines. One of the best offensive line, if not the best offensive line, pass blocking wise in the NFL. I mean, T.Y. Hilton is going to improve. He only played 14 games last season, but in the 3rd game in which he was medically pulled, it was only in the first half that he got to play. So, to be honest, he really only played 13 and a half games last season, ended the number 14 wide receiver in fantasy last year. And I think he's going to take that step forward within this offense, improving to see himself be in the top 12 conversation. And that's why I have him at my number 10. I think with the offense of the Indianapolis Colts improving, there's a consistent baseline of what we've seen T.Y. Hilton produce on a yearly basis, and I think that can improve, in his entire career, because Andrew Luck and T.Y. Hilton were both drafted in 2012. T.Y. Hilton was the 3rd-round pick that year. Every season that they've played together, T.Y. Hilton has averaged 75 receptions, 1,188 yards, and 6 receptions. So literally almost identical numbers to last season. That is what he's averaged. And if that's the baseline of what we're going to get, I think in this offense, in which there's such an improvement from years prior, perhaps one of the best Colts team we've seen in the Andrew Luck tenure, this offense is only going to improve, and I think T.Y. Hilton is going to improve statistically. That's why I have him on my number 10. All right, moving on. I'm literally sitting in a sauna. I'm burning my skin. It doesn't matter. I'm dehydrated. I need some Gatorade. I need a Gatorade sponsorship. Somebody get me a Gatorade sponsorship. Get me this color Gatorade, the light baby blue. Goodness gracious. Okay, pure sugar. All right, let's move on to my number 11 wide receiver, Robert Woods. Now, a lot of you maybe like Andrew, you're crazy. You're a Rams fan. Listen, I'm also a Cowboys fan. I don't see Amari Cooper on this list. So we're talking about Robert Woods. Last season, 130 targets, 86 receptions, 1,219 receiving yards, 157 rushing yards, 6 touchdowns through the air, and 1 touchdown on the ground, all leading to 222.6 fantasy points and 13.91 fantasy points per game. Last season, he was the number 10 wide receiver in fantasy and half-point PPR scoring formats. So here's the thing about Robert Woods. His consistency is there, right? You're a part of one of the highest scoring offenses in the league in the past 2 seasons. The team has averaged nearly 30 points per game in the last 2 years. And you're the number 1 wide receiver there. I understand they've brought in the likes of Brandon Cooks this past season. You have Cooper Kupp. You have Todd Gurley, who absorbs a lot of this fantasy value. But that doesn't mean that Jared Goff is not throwing the ball on a consistent basis. And he finds Robert Woods a majority of the times. Robert Woods had a 22.88, nearly 23% target share last season with 130 targets. Again, he had an atrocious, a terrible target share in the red zone, only accumulating to 11.88% of the targets. He had 12 targets under 101 passing attempts from the Rams in the red zone, which led to 7 receptions and 4 touchdowns. Again, his red zone target share was not there, yet he ended as the number 10 wide receiver in fantasy last year. Now, why is that? Now, here's the narrative I'm trying to explain. Robert Woods, no matter what this offense goes through, is a consistent wide receiver. And in fact, he improves when the team is a little bit out of balance. Now let me explain. Last season, when Todd Gurley ran the ball 20 plus times in a game, Robert Woods was one of the best wide receivers a part of this offense. He wasn't statistically affected by the fact that this team wanted to run the ball consistently. In games where Todd Gurley ran the ball 20 plus times, Robert Woods averaged 14.02 fantasy points per game, which is better than his league average by the end of the season, which was 13.9. Now, you may be thinking, okay, great. He's the number 1 wide receiver. Even when Gurley runs the ball, he sees a lot of targets and a lot of fantasy value. That's not all. Many of you may be thinking, with the addition of Cooper Kupp coming back from his ACL injury, we saw Cooper Kupp being one of the best wide receivers last year prior to his injury, correct? Yes, in fantasy he was fantastic. But Robert Woods with Cooper Kupp is even a better receiver when he's on the field, when the entire offense is whole. Last season when Cooper Kupp was on the field, Robert Woods 55 targets, 38 receptions for 575 yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, 93 rushing yards, all accumulating to 103.8 fantasy points. So meaning with Cooper Kupp, he averaged 14.83 fantasy points per game. Imagine that. So when Cooper Kupp's on the field, he's fantastic. It doesn't matter. When Todd Gurley's running amok and destroying teams, doesn't matter. Robert Woods is a consistent wide receiver. And even though he only had 3 wide receiver 1 performances last year, he had a boatload of wide receiver 2 performances. He found consistency, and he found himself producing for fantasy owners. And that's why I have him as my number 11 wide receiver going into 2019. All right. The last wide receiver I wanted to mention, a little bit of a controversial wide receiver because there's another wide receiver on his team that could be just as valuable. Adam Thielen of the Minnesota Vikings last season had 153 targets for 113 receptions, 1,373 receiving yards, 9 receiving touchdowns for 250.8 fantasy points. All of that was 15.65 fantasy points per game. Now, here's the thing about Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen had one of the most impressive first halves of a season I've ever seen by a wide receiver. And a lot of that is going to hurt his fantasy potential when it comes to this offseason. A lot of people are saying Adam Thielen can't be trusted because of what he did in the second half comparatively to the first half. So I thought I'd kind of, spread the love and, shine some light on exactly what Adam Thielen was capable of producing and what he did produce in the first and second half of last season. So from weeks 1 through 8, Adam Thielen was ridiculous. 96 targets, 74 receptions, 925 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns. All of that leading to 165 of his 250 fantasy points. And that basically led to 20.62 fantasy points per game in the first 8 weeks of the season. Pretty impressive, right? Now, here's the thing. The unfortunate part is Adam Thielen in the second half of the season, not as good. In fact, his average points per game nearly got cut in half. from weeks 9 through 17, only averaged 10.72 fantasy points per game, and was pretty much a mess. Had, a 50% drop in he had a 50% drop in receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, nearly in targets, but a lot of the offense was not going towards Adam Thielen in the second half of the season. Now, I'm throwing out this narrative, yes, because there's a little bit of controversy behind Adam Thielen, but I think that I have enough confidence in him next season, in his second season with Kirk Cousins, in an offense that is going to improve, because last season we saw the Minnesota Vikings literally only throw the ball. They could not run the ball to save their lives. The offensive line was a mess, causing Kirk Cousins to have to run for his life at times. But he still saw 25% of the target share, 27.78% of the target share in the red zone. So that was 20 targets for 15 receptions and 6 touchdowns. I think Adam Thielen having those, I think he had 8 consecutive games of 100 receiving yards to start the season. I think that, yes, may be an anomaly. It may be something that we're never going to see again out of Adam Thielen. But I think as the number one wide receiver of the Minnesota offense, in an offense that's honestly just disregarded by many people, I think a lot of people are sleeping on the fact that Kirk Cousins threw 30 touchdowns last season, and the fact that Dalvin Cook is going to improve this year. And this defense, I mean, if they only just set up the offense a little bit more, everyone's going to improve. So Adam Thielen's my last wide receiver in my top 12. Again, these rankings are subject to change. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you have any rankings of your own, let me know what you think should be changed. Again, everything's subject to change. But if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Click that like button if you like this video. And until next time, which will be tight end rankings next Saturday, thank you again, everybody, for watching. And I'll see you guys later. Peace.